So the third case I want to talk about was also a project of the Naugatuck Valley Project. And this was a housing cooperative, actually a cluster of housing cooperatives. And an interesting thing about the Naugatuck Valley Project, a lot of co-ops of various kinds and other economic development efforts are created essentially by organizations that are in the business of developing enterprises or co-ops, and they think about it as creating a business. So Naugatuck Valley Project approached these questions really as an organizing program. And if what came out of it was a company, a co-op, that was a good way to meet the problems and the needs of the people who were organizing, that was cool. And they would bring up that regularly as a possibility people should consider. But it wasn't really for the purpose of creating an enterprise that they were doing this work. It was from the perspective of helping people organize in order to address some set of problems and needs that they had. So consequently, they were, when they were approached by a group of tenants in a very old housing project, and said, we want to organize, we're facing, our place has just been sold to a new owner who is milking it. He doesn't do any repairs, and at the same time he keeps raising the rent, and he's obviously trying to get rid of the people who are here, many of whom have been there for decades. And if he can get them out, probably he's planning to then fix up the place and rent it at a much higher rate. What can we do about it? And so they did a normal creating a tenants organization, and they tried to enter negotiations with the owner. They threatened to have a rent strike, and none of this was effective. And so they thought, well, why don't we buy it? They knew about these other activities that the NVP was involved with. They said, why don't we buy it as the tenants? And so they were planning to do that, and they were completely dicked around by the owner, who continued to act in a very abusive way, and wouldn't sell or name the price that was so high that it was completely out of the question. And finally they said, well, why don't we build our own housing project? So that was very congenial to the approach of the Naugatuck Valley Project. And they brought in another organization, consultant, ICE, the Institute for Community Economics, that specializes in cooperative housing and land trusts. And I'll come back to talking about land trusts when we get into what they actually did. But they looked around. Before they were able to actually start, they began to say, well, the first thing we need is a piece of land. And they looked around, and they talked to a bunch of different people who had pieces of land, and that brokers took them to. And they found one that was really perfect for what they were trying to do. And meanwhile, they were also involved with a big campaign to win support for this project from the housing department of the state of Connecticut, and persuading them that this kind of operation, where this kind of cooperative, was something that was really a valuable approach, which they were very successful at, and it became a central part of the housing strategy for the Connecticut Department of Housing. So the they were trying to buy this piece of land, and one thing after another went wrong. One permit would be turned down, then another permit, they couldn't find out how to get it. Then the price was changed. Then this was going on and on and on and on. And it turned out that they had fallen right into the worst of Waterbury municipal corruption. And as some of you may be aware, that's a high standard. The mayor and city council who were in charge at this time were actually behind the scenes preventing them from buying this property because they had their own objectives. And this was one of the main counts against them in a federal indictment that had dozens and dozens of similar kind of criminal corruption, corrupt use of their powers of the city government. But they were not able to find out about this until later on, although they had their suspicions. So finally, they gave up on that piece of land and looked around and found another piece of land. They got their state funding, and they began building, I believe, 18 buildings with 6 co-ops. Each co-op has 3 buildings in it. Each building had about 6 apartments in it. And how was this paid for? They got a substantial amount of money from the state. Each one person who was going to live there was responsible for a small down payment, but they could provide that down payment by sweat equity in building what came to be known as Brookside housing. So they actually pulled it off. They moved in. The way it worked was there was a co-op which owned 3 of these apartment buildings together. The co-op members were the tenants, and they collectively owned, as a tenants association, the buildings that they lived in. They had protected rights in the sense that it wasn't like a landlord who can throw you out anytime they want. They could only be thrown out for things that would be serious problems for the other tenants. And there was a vehicle for the tenants collectively to protect themselves against really bad behavior on the part of the other tenants, but it was well hedged in so that people could not just be thrown out on anybody's whim. The tenants were given training in management, and then they were the managers of the whole operation. And there's one other piece which makes this a very interesting model. They had the co-ops, but the actual land that they were on was owned by a land trust. And a land trust is a nonprofit organization. We're probably most familiar with conservation land trusts. Many Connecticut towns have conservation land trusts where someone will donate the development rights to a piece of land to a land trust, and that means that it is preserved as forest or as a natural area, and there's still use rights to the person that donates it, which are included in the agreement that's written up, but it can't be developed. It has to be preserved. And a group of people actually coming out of the civil rights movement in large part took this idea and said, why don't we do this for housing? Why don't we do this for community development? And develop the idea of a community land trust, which would own the land that housing was on, in this case, cooperative housing, and provide it for the public purpose of providing permanently affordable housing. Well, why go through all this rigmarole, you ask? The underlying reason for the land trust model is that in our society, in a capitalist society, and especially in American capitalism, the value of land over the long haul goes up and up and up. It is a dream for speculation, and people invest in land because they know that nobody's making any more of it. And so if you're making widgets, and there's too much demand for widgets, somebody's going to come along and make more widgets. That's the positive side of capitalism. But when it comes to land, you can't make any more. And so you have a guaranteed speculative gain that goes up and up and up. And that is a major part of why housing is so expensive and why housing prices keep on rising year by year, decade by decade, and century by century. So what this does with the land trust is to provide for permanent affordability. And I would just throw out as an aside that something of this kind, for people who like the idea of socialism, but don't like the idea of things that are too centralized, this is a way that you can make a kind of mixed model that includes basic non-capitalist economic principles, but can do it in a way that is in a number of respects decentralized and let's say easily subject to democratic control, whereas a completely centralized economy, so far we haven't really found a great way to subject it to democratic control. So I'm not saying this is the answer, but I'm saying it's something to think about as one piece of how the kind of socialist society that we might actually want to live in could be constructed. Same, of course, goes for co-ops. So Brookside is still there. It is still affordable. It has been, it is primarily a place for people of a variety of ethnic backgrounds, racial backgrounds, immigrants. It's a very diverse group, and they have admission criteria which are designed to keep it that way. One of the things they did when they started, there was a guy on the committee that was organizing it who was disabled, and he insisted, he said that, you think other people have problems getting housing in Waterbury, you should see what it's like for disabled people. We've got to have apartments for disabled people. And so they did that were designed by disabled people to make sure that it wasn't just barrier free, but was really designed to be viable for people with disabilities. And there were other people who said, you think it's hard to get a house for an ordinary family, a family that has 4 kids or 6 kids, it's absolutely impossible to find affordable housing. And so they deliberately included apartments that were specifically for larger families in this. So the point I'm making about this is because of the democratic character and control of it by working people and the community, there were very specific things that were done in order to make it meet the needs of people that just wouldn't happen in a normal, oh, let's build some housing for poor people. We'll go and hire an architect and do it the way is currently thought of how you do it, or how, worse yet, how somebody who is trying to figure out how to make a buck off it would do it. It's still there. It's still functional after about 20 years. It needed a lot of repairs and maintenance, and they got another grant from the state to refurbish it. And one of the things they did in that was to make it do a very high level of weatherization and making it more and much more energy efficient. It remains one other thing I should have said it before is that when they moved into it, the people who had kind of first dibs were the group that had started it and started trying to buy their own place years before, and then stuck with it for years trying to build their own place. And they had first option to move in, but there was lots of other space for other people, and it became part of the available, very limited, decent affordable housing in the city of Waterbury.